The Rowan estate stands at the edge of Edivane Wood, where the fog never lifts and the trees seem to whisper when the wind dies. Locals call it the house that remembers, though no one has stepped past its rusted gate in over 70 years. The story goes that in the spring of 1953, the Rowan family vanished without a sound. The father, a reclusive surgeon. The mother, an artist with a fascination for death masks. And the daughters, 3 of them, whose laughter once filled the gardens with life. By the time the police arrived, the only thing left was a half-set dinner table, 3 untouched glasses of milk, and the sound of music still playing from the gramophone. The Rowan estate stood like a wound upon the edge of Edivane Wood, its crumbling stone facade veiled in a mist that never lifted, as if the fog itself had made a vow to keep the place hidden from the living. Generations of villagers had grown old beneath its silent gaze, whispering its name only in the safety of daylight. The estate was enormous once, a symbol of refinement and wealth, but time had twisted its beauty into something ghostly. The ivy that climbed its walls had turned black from rot, curling over shattered windows like the veins of a dying creature. Its gates, heavy with rust, leaned inward as though tired of guarding something too heavy to contain. There were those who swore the iron bars moaned when the wind passed through them, a sound almost human, almost sorrowful, as though the house itself remembered what it had lost. Edivane Wood was no ordinary forest. Its trees grew too close together, their branches forming a canopy that let no sunlight reach the soil. The air within was always damp, the ground soft and uneven, swallowing footprints before they could be followed. It was said that the woods had once been part of the Rowan property, planted by the first generation to shield their home from the eyes of outsiders. Over the decades, though, it had grown wild, untamed, reclaiming its dominion inch by inch until the estate stood on its very edge, like a prisoner cornered by its own creation. Travelers who wandered too close spoke of hearing faint laughter among the trees, or the distant chime of a piano, though there was no house for miles besides the one that no one dared approach. Locals had a name for the place, the house that remembers. They said the walls held memories like wounds, that every sigh of the wind through the shutters was the echo of a voice long gone. The older folk claimed that if you stood by the gates at dusk, you could hear the faint melody of a gramophone drifting through the fog, playing the same song that was found spinning on the night the family disappeared. It was not just a story for tourists or children, even the bravest among the villagers kept their distance. A few thrill-seekers, drawn by curiosity or the promise of proving their courage, had ventured inside over the years. None stayed long. Those who returned spoke little, their eyes hollow, muttering about shadows that moved without light and whispers that came from nowhere. The mystery of the Rowan family had become a legend woven into the fabric of the village. In the spring of 1953, on a night that began like any other, the household vanished. There was no sign of struggle, no broken windows, no footprints leading away from the estate. The father, Dr. Elias Rowan, was a man of reputation but few friends. Known for his surgical precision and unshakable calm, he had left the city years earlier after a scandal no one could clearly recall. He was a figure both respected and feared, rumored to have conducted experiments that blurred the line between medicine and obsession. His wife, Lillian Rowan, was an artist whose fascination with death masks had once been dismissed as eccentric, until her work began to take on an unsettling realism, as though the faces she molded were not entirely from imagination. Their daughters, Isolde, Clara, and Marianne, were said to be inseparable, a trio of brightness against the gloom of their home. They were seen in the village market only rarely, always polite, always together, their laughter light enough to momentarily break the unease that surrounded the Rowan name. But when the spring of 1953 came, their laughter vanished with them. When the police arrived days later, they found the front door ajar, the great hall illuminated by the weak glow of a chandelier still burning through melted wax. The table was set for dinner, 5 places, though only 3 glasses of milk sat untouched beside the plates. The silverware gleamed as though it had been polished that morning. In the corner, a gramophone played a slow waltz, the record spinning endlessly in a loop of static and sorrow. There was no sign of disturbance, no blood, no struggle. Upstairs, the beds were made, the closets untouched, the walls lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow the intruders. The only movement came from the curtains that shifted gently, though every window was sealed. The investigation yielded nothing. No footprints in the mud outside, no carriage tracks leading away from the estate, no letters or notes explaining a sudden departure. The servants had left months before, dismissed abruptly without explanation. The doctor's medical journals were missing their final pages. Lillian's studio was locked, and when it was forced open, they found the unfinished molds of faces, 3 of them small, delicate, and disturbingly lifelike. The authorities closed the case as unresolved disappearance, but the villagers knew better. They said the house had taken them back, claimed what belonged to it. In the years that followed, nature reclaimed what remained of the estate. Moss crept over the stone steps, the gardens wilted into a tangle of thorns, and the windows clouded with grime until no light escaped. Yet, the house stood, untouched by storms, unbroken by time. Even those who dared to photograph it said their cameras malfunctioned, the images emerging blurred, as if the building resisted being captured. The Rowan estate became a scar upon the land, a place where the air grew colder, the silence heavier. Children growing up nearby were warned not to play near the gates. Hunters avoided the woods beyond it. Travelers passing through often found themselves slowing near the boundary of the estate, compelled to glance toward its shadow, only to shudder and move on. Some claimed to see a figure at one of the upper windows, a woman in a white dress, standing motionless against the glass, her face pale as moonlight. Others swore they heard the faint sound of music, the same waltz that had once echoed through the empty halls. Whether the house truly remembered or the villagers simply could not forget, the Rowan estate remained exactly as it was that spring night, a place frozen between memory and mourning, waiting for someone foolish or brave enough to cross its rusted gate again. Dr. Elias Rowan was not a man easily understood, even by those who lived under his roof. To the village below, he was a figure both fascinating and forbidding, a surgeon whose reputation for brilliance had once earned him accolades in the city, and whose sudden retreat to the countryside had stirred endless speculation. Before he vanished, whispers followed him like a shadow. Some said he had performed surgeries that went beyond the limits of accepted science, others believed he had become obsessed with preserving life, unwilling to accept death as nature's end. When he purchased the estate at the edge of Edivane Wood, many assumed he sought peace and isolation. Yet what peace could be found in a house surrounded by fog and silence was anyone's guess. Those who recalled him from his city days described a man with sharp eyes and a surgeon's hands, steady, deliberate, unyielding. He rarely smiled and never indulged in conversation beyond necessity. His wife, Lillian, was the opposite, artistic, expressive, drawn to the strange beauty in decay. She adored her husband, but even she confessed to friends that there were parts of him she could never reach, places in his mind that were like locked rooms. He kept journals, hundreds of them, bound in leather and arranged neatly in his study. They contained sketches, anatomical diagrams, and writings that blurred the boundary between science and madness. When the police searched his study after the disappearance, they found many of these volumes missing, the shelves half empty as if someone had taken the most important pieces of his work. Dr. Rowan had once been at the forefront of experimental surgery, working on techniques meant to restore damaged organs and revive failing hearts. His colleagues admired his innovation but feared his ambition. It was said that he began to question not only how to heal the living but how to reverse the process of dying itself. The death of his first patient, a young boy who had not survived a complex operation, seemed to mark a turning point. Those close to him said he changed after that, becoming obsessed with the idea that death was merely a problem to be solved, that consciousness could be preserved even after the body failed. His letters to other doctors grew more erratic, filled with cryptic references to continuing the voice beyond the flesh and reuniting memory with form. When his funding was cut and his license quietly revoked, he left the city without protest, taking his family to the Rowan estate where no one could interfere. The villagers seldom saw him. Occasionally, his carriage would appear on the long road leading to the manor, and those who caught sight of him said he looked thinner, paler, his face marked by sleeplessness. Deliveries of medical equipment arrived regularly, crates of glass jars, surgical tools, chemicals, and strange contraptions that no one recognized. Once, a local boy claimed to have peered through the iron gate and seen lights flickering from the basement windows late at night, followed by the faint sound of a woman crying. When asked what he thought he had witnessed, Dr. Rowan simply replied that his work demanded unusual hours. Inside the house, his presence loomed over every room. He converted one of the upper floors into a private laboratory, locking it each night. Even his wife was forbidden to enter. The walls of the manor were said to hum faintly at times, as if some unseen machinery pulsed within them. Lillian wrote in her diary that she often woke in the middle of the night to find her husband standing by the window, staring into the fog, his reflection blending with the darkness outside. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was often about the nature of the soul, whether it was bound to the body or if it could linger after death, attached to the memory of a place. His fascination with the concept of consciousness beyond life became an obsession that consumed every waking moment. The few visitors who ventured to the manor described the doctor's demeanor as polite but distracted, as though his mind existed elsewhere. One of his former colleagues, who visited him months before the disappearance, later recounted that Dr. Rowan had grown increasingly cryptic, speaking about voices in the static and a memory as energy. He believed the human brain left behind traces, imprints, that could be revived under the right conditions. To him, death was not the end but a pause in perception. He hinted at an experiment he called continuity of self, though he refused to elaborate. The colleague left disturbed, convinced that Elias Rowan had descended into dangerous delusion. What Lillian knew of her husband's experiments remained unclear. She seemed to share a quiet dread of his work but never confronted him openly. Perhaps she loved him too much to interfere, or perhaps she feared what she might find. Her own art began to reflect his obsessions. The death masks she molded became eerily lifelike, capturing expressions too vivid for mere clay. Some believed she was attempting to preserve something of the family, to immortalize their faces before whatever her husband was pursuing consumed them all. The daughters often played in the garden while their father worked, unaware of the growing tension between their parents. They were the only brightness in that house of shadows, their laughter echoing through the halls that had grown too accustomed to silence. As time passed, the doctor withdrew completely. Servants were dismissed without explanation. Deliveries stopped. The manor became a sealed world, its gates locked, its curtains drawn. On the rare occasions when someone approached to deliver supplies, they claimed to hear strange noises from within, metallic clattering, low humming, and once, the unmistakable sound of someone screaming before abruptly falling silent. None dared to return a second time. Then came the night of their disappearance. The clock in the village struck 10 when a faint glow was seen rising from the Rowan estate, pulsing like lightning behind the clouds. Some thought it was a fire, but no flames followed. The light flickered once more, then vanished. When dawn came, the fog over Edivainwood grew thicker than it had ever been. The manor stood still and lifeless, its windows black. When investigators entered days later, they found signs of recent work in the doctor's study, papers scattered, instruments half cleaned, and on the desk, a single page bearing his handwriting. If memory persists beyond form, then perhaps the house will remember. No trace of the family was ever found. But from that day forward, those who passed by the estate claimed to hear the faint ticking of unseen machinery within the walls, as if something of Dr. Elias Rowan's great experiment had survived him, continuing endlessly in the place where his obsession began. Lillian Rowan was unlike the women the villagers were accustomed to, elegant, distant, and always seen with her sketchbook or a bundle of clay-stained cloths tucked beneath her arm. Before she became the mistress of the Rowan estate, she had been an artist of modest acclaim, known for her delicate sculptures and her fascination with capturing the essence of the human face. But while others sculpted beauty, Lillian sculpted truth, and truth, to her, was often unsettling. She believed that a face revealed more in stillness than in life, and that the final expression a person carried into death was the purest reflection of their soul. What began as a fascination became a fixation, one that would shape both her art and her fate within the walls of the estate. Her studio was located in the eastern wing, a place perpetually dim despite the wide windows that faced the fog-choked woods. The smell of plaster, clay, and turpentine hung in the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of lilies that she kept in a vase by the window. The walls were lined with shelves stacked high with molds, busts, and half-finished sculptures, some serene, others twisted in expressions of fear or wonder. Visitors often found the space disturbing, though Lillian herself found comfort in it. She would spend hours alone there, her hands working methodically as if guided by something beyond her own will. Each piece she made seemed to breathe with a quiet intensity, as though it might at any moment turn its head to look back at her. Her fascination with death masks had begun years before, when her mother died suddenly of illness. Lillian, too grief-stricken to let her go, had taken a plaster cast of her face before burial, preserving her features as they were in that final moment. To her, it was not morbid, it was love, an act of remembrance. The mask was her way of defying the impermanence of life, of holding on to the one thing death could not erase, the memory of a face. Over time, what had begun as mourning turned into obsession. She began studying the history of funerary art, of preservation, of the boundary between beauty and decay. She corresponded with collectors and anatomists, seeking to understand not just how to capture a likeness, but how to trap the essence within it. When she married Elias Rowan, her fascination found new direction. His scientific pursuits mirrored her artistic ones. They both sought permanence, each in their own way. Where he dissected the body to understand its secrets, she molded it to preserve its form. For a time, they worked in harmony, sharing long nights in discussion about the nature of memory, the fragility of existence, and the possibility that art or science might offer a kind of immortality. But as Elias's work grew darker, so too did Lillian's. Her masks began to take on an eerie precision, their eyes seeming almost alive. She began using materials that did not come from any artist's shop, fine powders, strange resins, and once, something she described in her diary only as preservative solution from Elias. Neighbors who once admired her artistry began to speak uneasily of her new works. A tradesman who delivered marble to the estate recalled seeing one of her finished pieces covered with a shroud, its form unmistakably that of a child. Another visitor claimed to hear voices when he entered the studio, faint and echoing, as though the masks themselves whispered to one another when no one was looking. Lillian dismissed these stories as nonsense, but even she could not deny that something in her art had begun to shift. The masks no longer brought her peace. Instead, they filled her with unease, as though she were preserving not just likenesses, but fragments of something far less tangible. Her relationship with Elias strained under the weight of their obsessions. He became secretive, shutting himself away in his laboratory for days at a time, emerging with eyes hollow and trembling hands. Lillian tried to reach him, to understand what he was creating, but he only told her that he was close to an answer. When she pressed further, he turned cold, accusing her of meddling in things she could not comprehend. Yet beneath his anger, she sensed fear, not of her, but of whatever he had begun to uncover. To soothe herself, she turned back to her masks, but her art no longer obeyed her. She began to see faces in her dreams, the faces she had sculpted, staring at her with expressions of pity or accusation. She would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of faint humming through the walls, the same rhythmic pulse that came from Elias's laboratory. It was around this time that she began her final series, 3 small masks, delicate and unfinished, modeled after her daughters. She wrote in her diary that it was a mother's duty to preserve what time will take, though she never explained why she worked on them so feverishly. Servants who remained at the estate before being dismissed said they sometimes found her in the studio long past midnight, weeping as she molded the clay. Her hands were blistered from constant work, her hair streaked with grey though she was still young. Once, one of the girls was found sleepwalking into the studio, whispering, "Mama, they're calling me," though when asked who she meant, she could not remember. In her final days, Lillian grew restless, as though sensing the end drawing near. She confided to her journal that Elias had begun hearing voices that came from the house itself, repeating fragments of conversations that had long since passed. She believed the estate had begun to absorb them, that the walls, saturated with years of silence, had learned to remember. The thought both terrified and enthralled her. She began to suspect that her husband's experiments and her own art were not separate, but 2 halves of the same design, both seeking to defy oblivion. On the night the family vanished, Lillian's studio was found locked from within. When the authorities broke it open, they found the masks on her work table, still damp, their faces eerily peaceful. The tools were neatly arranged beside them, as though she had finished her task and simply stepped away. The window was open, the fog drifting in like breath. Among her papers was a single unfinished note, the words smeared but legible enough to read, "They are not gone. They are only remembered too well." The villagers later said that on quiet nights, when the wind turned toward Edivane Wood, you could still hear her humming a tune from within the manor, the same song she used to play while shaping the faces of the ones she loved. The Rowan daughters, Isolde, Clara, and Marianne, were the only light that ever seemed to cut through the gloom surrounding the estate. They were born within its walls, raised among the echoing corridors and shadowed gardens, their laughter the only sound that reminded anyone that life still existed there. Each was distinct in nature yet bound to the others with an almost unearthly closeness. Isolde, the eldest at 13, had her father's sharp gaze and her mother's quiet intensity. Clara, 2 years younger, was restless and curious, forever exploring the corners of the house where no one else dared to go. Marianne, the youngest, was delicate and soft-spoken, a child who seemed to sense things before they happened. To the villagers who occasionally saw them when Lillian brought them into town, they appeared like figures from another world, pale, graceful, and always moving together, as if afraid that separation would cause them to disappear. The 3 girls spent most of their days in the gardens, though the gardens were not what they once had been. Once carefully tended, they had grown wild, the paths overtaken by weeds and the fountains choked with algae. Yet to the sisters, it was a kingdom of their own making. They named the overgrown hedges after the constellations, built little altars of stones and feathers, and played among the withered rosebushes that still carried the faint scent of life. The servants often said that their laughter echoed strangely through the fog, carrying farther than it should, as if the mist itself played with their voices. There was something haunting in their joy, something too pure for the house that held them. Their lives inside the manor followed a rhythm of stillness and whispers. Lillian homeschooled them, teaching them art, poetry, and music, while Elias instructed them on anatomy, physiology, and the workings of the human body. It was an unusual education for children so young, but the girls absorbed it all with fascination rather than fear. Isolde took particular interest in her father's lessons, watching him with wide eyes as he explained the fragile mechanisms that kept the body alive. Clara preferred her mother's world, sculpting small figures out of clay and whispering to them as though they could hear. Marianne drifted between them, quiet and observant, often sketching her sisters in her notebook while they worked. There was love in that household, though it was a strange, fragile kind, love surrounded by the tension of secrets that neither parent was willing to explain. As time passed, the changes in the house began to seep into the children. The fog outside seemed thicker, the air inside colder. At night, the girls would wake to the sound of footsteps in the halls, slow and measured, though their parents would insist it was only the house settling. Once, Clara swore she saw someone standing at the end of the corridor, a figure that looked like their father but moved as if it were made of smoke. When she told Lillian, her mother went pale and said nothing. The sisters began to dream the same dreams, of music playing in distant rooms, of voices whispering from the walls, of their reflections in the mirrors smiling a moment too long after they turned away. Marianne began to talk in her sleep, repeating phrases she could not remember upon waking, phrases that Elias would later write down in his notebooks, calling them utterances from memory's residue. Their bond deepened as the strangeness grew. The servants noticed that they no longer played separately. If one was missing, the other two would stop what they were doing and call her name until she appeared. They began to finish each other's sentences, to speak in unison without meaning to. Once, a maid overheard them standing by a locked door, whispering, "He's waiting," though when asked who they meant, they only smiled. The doctor dismissed it as childish imagination, but even he began to notice their eyes sometimes glazed over when the gramophone played the old waltz Lillian loved. It was as though something in the melody reached them in a way it did not reach others, as though they were remembering something not of this world. As the family's isolation deepened, the girls became the heart of every rumor that spread through the village. Children whispered that they could see the Rowan sisters standing at the window when the moon was full, staring down at the woods as if expecting someone to emerge. Others claimed that their laughter still echoed long after nightfall, when the house should have been silent. One story told of a hunter who passed too close to the estate and saw three figures walking hand in hand through the fog, their dresses pale and fluttering, their faces hidden by their hair. When he called out to them, they turned toward him, and though their features were soft and childlike, their eyes were dark and hollow. He ran until the forest spat him out onto the road, swearing never to return. Inside the house, the girls' behavior became more peculiar. Isolde began keeping a small notebook filled with sketches of faces, some familiar, others not. When Elias found it, he noticed that several of the faces were identical to those of people long dead, including the servants who had once worked in the estate. Clara began collecting objects from the house, broken keys, buttons, feathers, even small bones from the garden, and arranging them in patterns that made no sense. Marianne grew silent, spending hours by the gramophone, turning the crank and letting the same song play over and over. Lillian tried to comfort her, but Marianne would only say, "It helps them remember." The night before the disappearance, one of the neighbors claimed to have seen lights flickering in the upper windows, moving from room to room as though the family were awake and pacing. A storm rolled over Edivainwood that evening, though not a drop of rain touched the estate. Inside, according to the final notes in Elias's journal, the girls had begun speaking in voices not their own, repeating fragments of old conversations, nursery rhymes their mother had taught them years before, and lines from the poetry she had read aloud by candlelight. He wrote that the house seemed to respond to them, that when they spoke, the air changed, the walls almost shivered. When investigators later entered the manor, they found traces of the girls everywhere but not a single sign of where they had gone. Their rooms were immaculate. Dresses laid out neatly across their beds, dolls placed in perfect alignment, books open to pages marked by small, careful hands. In the corner of Marianne's room sat the gramophone, its record still spinning though the sound had long since faded. On the wall, faint outlines of 3 small handprints were visible in the dust, as if the children had reached out together and vanished into air. The villagers who spoke of it afterward said that the house had taken them, that the fog had simply folded around their laughter and kept it. And on quiet nights, when the wind blew from Edivainwood, That laughter could still be heard faintly from the direction of the Rowan estate, echoing like the memory of something the world was never meant to forget. When the police finally arrived at the Rowan estate in the days following the family's disappearance, they found a scene suspended in eerie perfection, as though time itself had stopped mid-motion. The gates were unlatched but not broken, the pathway leading to the front door covered in a thin layer of mist that seemed to cling to the ground like breath. Inside, the air was cold and heavy, thick with the scent of extinguished candles and old dust. The first thing they noticed was the silence, not the ordinary stillness of an empty house, but a silence that seemed to press against the walls, almost listening. The manor appeared to be waiting, aware of their intrusion. Every creak of the floorboards echoed unnaturally, as if the sound lingered too long before fading. Nothing in the house appeared disturbed, yet everything felt wrong, as though the people who lived there had only just stepped out of sight. In the dining room, the table was set for dinner. Plates gleamed beneath the light of a single chandelier, whose candles had burned nearly to stubs. The meal looked half-prepared, a roast gone cold beside bowls of vegetables untouched. 3 glasses of milk stood beside empty chairs, their surfaces still smooth and unbroken. The silver cutlery was arranged perfectly, the napkins folded in precise triangles, as though the family had planned to sit down together any moment. On the far wall, the gramophone spun slowly, its record looping the same soft waltz over and over, the sound warping as the needle traced the grooves for what must have been hours. The tune was mournful, familiar, and hauntingly serene, a melody that might have been comforting had it not filled such an empty room. One of the investigators remarked later that it was the kind of song one might hear in a dream that turned suddenly to nightmare. No signs of struggle were found. No overturned chairs, no broken glass, no signs of forced entry. Every door in the house was locked from the inside, except the front, which hung slightly ajar. Upstairs, the bedrooms appeared untouched. The beds were neatly made, the wardrobes closed, the curtains drawn. In the children's room, dolls were arranged in a circle on the floor, as though waiting for a game to begin. A faint indentation on the mattress suggested someone had been sitting there recently. On the writing desk by the window, there was a sketchbook left open to a drawing of 3 girls holding hands in front of the house, their faces serene, their eyes shaded dark. Lillian's studio was one of the first rooms to draw attention. The air inside was colder than the rest of the manor, and the light filtering through the fogged glass cast everything in a muted grey. On her work table sat several death masks, 3 small ones, unfinished, and a 4th, cracked down the center. They were remarkably lifelike, their features delicate and hauntingly familiar. Nearby, her tools lay neatly aligned, the plaster still damp in one of the bowls as if she had only stepped away for a moment. The smell of clay and decay filled the air. Among the scattered sketches on her desk, one piece of parchment caught their attention. Written in Lillian's hand, it read, "They are only sleeping, in the walls that remember." Dr. Elias Rowan's study revealed more unsettling details. Papers were strewn across his desk, filled with complex notes and strange equations, as though he had been in the midst of some great discovery. Several anatomical diagrams were pinned to the wall, alongside sketches of the human brain labeled with words like echo, memory, and resonance. His last journal lay open, ink smudged where his hand had brushed across the page. The final entry read, "The boundaries are thinning. The voices do not fade. The experiment is complete." Behind the desk, a locked cabinet was forced open, revealing rows of glass jars filled with cloudy liquid. Each jar contained something unidentifiable, small, shapeless forms suspended in preservation. One officer swore he saw movement within one of them, a faint ripple beneath the surface, though when he looked again, it was still. The investigation spread across the manor, but the deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The basement, once used for storage, appeared recently disturbed. Marks were found on the walls, patterns resembling handprints, pressed into the dust, some too small to be adult. The officers reported an overwhelming sense of unease, as though they were being watched from every direction. One of them described hearing faint whispers, indistinct but rhythmic, like the murmur of voices just beyond understanding. Another claimed that when he passed the large mirror in the hallway, he saw movement behind him that wasn't his own reflection. The mirror later cracked on its own, a single line running through its center like a wound. Despite their efforts, no trace of the Rowan family could be found. No footprints led away from the house, no evidence of abduction or escape. The clock in the Great Hall had stopped precisely at 10:07, and every timepiece in the house displayed the same hour. The gramophone, when finally silenced, emitted a faint static hum, and for a moment, several investigators claimed to hear faint laughter through it, a sound childlike and distant, fading as the record was lifted. They chose not to record that detail in their official report, dismissing it as imagination born of exhaustion. After weeks of investigation, the estate was sealed, the case marked unresolved. Theories abounded, some rational, others macabre. A few believed the doctor had murdered his family in a fit of madness before taking his own life and hiding the evidence. Others whispered that he had succeeded in his experiment, whatever it was, and that the family had simply crossed into something beyond comprehension. The villagers, however, told a different story. They said the Rowans had not died at all, that the house had absorbed them, that their spirits still wandered its halls, replaying the final moments of their lives in endless repetition. They called it the house that remembers because it seemed to breathe with their presence, because the fog that never lifted was said to carry their voices when the night was still. Over the years, the manor was left untouched. Ivy crept across its walls, the gardens turned to wilderness, and the roof sagged under the weight of time. Yet, those who lived nearby continued to report strange phenomena. The faint glow of candlelight in upper windows. Music drifting through the trees long after midnight. Children's laughter weaving through the fog. Some travelers swore they saw silhouettes moving behind the curtains, 3 small figures and the outline of a woman standing by the window. No one stayed long enough to find out if what they saw was real. The police files remained locked away, the case forgotten by most. But to those who passed the edge of Edivane Wood, the truth was never in question. The Rowan family had not simply vanished, they had become part of the house itself, bound to its memory, their lives and voices stitched into the fabric of its walls, forever repeating the night they disappeared.